All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Maureen Conway, and I am so delighted, can't even tell you how delighted I am, to welcome you to this event, launching this book, Connecting People to Work, Workforce Intermediaries, and Sector Strategies. Coming out right on schedule, right? This book was the work of a lot of people, and many of my colleagues here at the Institute worked really hard on this. Colleagues at Annie Casey, our publisher at the American Assembly, editor at the Hatcher Group. I've learned a lot about how much work it takes to put together a book. So I want to say thank you to all those people who really helped. And I particularly want to thank all of the authors. And today we have 3 here with us to talk about the book and talk about some of the things in the book. But there were about 25 authors that contributed to this book. It's really a nice collection from people who have experience in practice, in research, in policy, and for not very much recompense agreed to contribute their long experience and wisdom and to think with us about what we've learned over the past decade about connecting people to work. So I thank all of them as well. A particular thanks to the Annie Casey Foundation that has been financially supporting this, but also been a real partner in this work. And in particular, I have to thank Bob Giloth, who I will introduce in just a moment, for being such a great partner. I have a couple of logistical things to say before I introduce Bob, which is please silence your phone. But feel free to tweet. The hashtag is #ConnectToWork. It's connect, the number 2, and then WRK. And then I also do want to say we've had a special thanks to Andy Van Clunen here, who you'll notice is not Laura Dresser. Laura unfortunately could not get out of Madison last night due to the storms, and Andy graciously agreed to join us for this panel today, so we're really pleased to have him here, and Laura sends her regrets. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce my co-editor for this volume, Robert P. Giloth, Vice President, Center for Community and Economic Opportunity at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, whom most of you probably know. And I just want to say, so there is a bio, though, if you aren't familiar with Bob and his work. He's a longtime investor in this work. He's a thought leader in this field. And when he asked me if I would be a thought partner with him in trying to pull this collection together, I could not have been more honored and pleased. And it has been a wonderful experience working with Bob. We've had many long conversations about how to structure the book and different chapters and different issues to think about. And I've really just learned a tremendous amount working with him. And it's just been a true pleasure to work with him in pulling this volume together. So I am delighted to introduce to you Bob Giloth to start our conversation. Thanks, Bob. And you can clap for him.
Clap for Maureen. Good afternoon. Thanks, Maureen. I should say, when we came up with the idea to edit this book, and I'll get to this later, we really wanted to draw together the various strands of sector workforce strategies around the country, and there's no better researcher, documenter of that work than Maureen Conway, so that's why I was privileged to have her as a co-editor, so thanks, Maureen. And thanks to Aspen for hosting this event, as well as the whole book project. Before I make a few opening remarks, I also want to thank David Mortimer. I don't know if he's here or not. I saw him on the list, but he's and his staff from the American Assembly. They're our publisher and sponsor, and they have been the recipient of all our whining about typos and other kinds of things, and they've, for the most part, dealt with that with a good spirit. They were also the group, and I'll say more about this later, that convened a conversation 10 years ago up in the mountains of New York around sector strategies. And in some ways, that was a pivot point for a lot of the investments over the last decade, and I'll talk about that as well. As Maureen said, there's lots of other folks to thank, some in the room, from authors to diligent proofers to tweeters and others, and it's really been a great group effort. Now, you may be asking, and I assume most of you have the book, you know, what's the big deal about an edited book? You know, after all, it's not likely to be a bestseller.
It's not.
In fact, there's a
You
high
told us. Bob, you promised us.
That's true enough. Now, I could say it's a work of love, but herding cats and obsessing over typos really wears down romance fairly quickly. But I must say the book, I've edited a number of books on workforce development and sector work, and this has really been the best. And it's best because the book, I think, captures, there's a set of authors who are program leaders, evaluators, investors, policy advocates of all different kinds. And there's debate and discussion in the book. It's not all everybody marching in line. So it's actually captures a conversation that mirrors the best of our work in the sector field. And I should say that, you know, the second reason for doing, another reason for doing the book was that there are some different strands of the sector field, and I'll come back to that, some of which don't all, you know, like many families, they don't all talk to each other on a regular basis. And we were trying to produce a book where that conversation among the various cousins and brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws was more front and center, and I think we accomplished that. Let me say a few things about the origin of the book and the central themes, and then I'll turn it to Maureen and a terrific panel. I mean, the simple reason for doing the book was, as I mentioned, 10 years ago, we had this conversation with the American Assembly, and I edited a book called Workforce Intermediaries for the 21st Century that set out a bunch of really the rationale, the practice for doing this kind of work. And it served as a way to jumpstart the conversation. And the American Assembly, as some of you may know, it's connected to Columbia University. They conduct nonpartisan dialogues. They have a special approach to that around social policy topics. And it was a very productive meeting of about 60. You were there, weren't you, Phyllis? Yeah. A number of us were on that snowy mount. We were snowed in for a weekend. So we thought it was time for a reflection after 10 years. A matter of some celebration of stuff that we'd accomplished together or with colleagues, but also a time to an opportunity to really take stock of what we've done, what hasn't been done, what challenges are ahead in the sector field. And there's a lot to celebrate. There's continued growth of sector workforce partnerships, as we call them, like Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership, a number of others. There's been a very important public-private ventures evaluation of the sector, 3 sector programs. The National Fund for Workforce Solution has been established. State efforts like Pennsylvania have really invested in industry partnerships in a serious way. And there have been a number of attempts at and progress around federal investments in sector efforts. So there's been a lot of positive work. And someone once told me that you could tell a strategy approach in workforce had legs if it survived at least one recession and a policy change. And I should say that another matter of celebration is surviving, the field surviving and to some degree prospering over the last 5 or 6 years. Now Maureen and the panel will say more about kind of what a sector strategy really is about, although many of you in the room kind of know it well. But let me just say a few things from my own perspective about why it's important. The heart of a sector approach is really focusing deeply on an industry and an occupation. The economic drivers, the stakeholders, the issues, whether they're technology, whether they're policy, whether they're spatial and regional. At heart, it's kind of a community organizing approach to really work with multiple businesses and connect them to unions, education and training institutions, community organizations, around a common task of training, filling jobs, filling skill gaps, actually even doing the kind of economic development needed at times for the sector to prosper. Getting everybody on that same page is not an easy task, and it's, despite WIA reauthorization, I still don't think there's any public money to pay for that community organizing work, and that's really been the rub. You know, how do you support that kind of deep engagement with business to really get everybody relatively on the same page? And in some sense, that's the magic of what these partnerships do on the ground. It's what state policy efforts have done, and it's certainly what the National Fund has been about. I first got involved in sector efforts in the 80s in Chicago, working for Mayor Hill Washington. At that point, it was more of an economic development tool, really looking at sectors as a way to do economic development, where there were those sectors were kind of under siege from a number of forces. And the issue, what I found in that experience and since then, is that there was really space to create robust partnerships with business that had results that in turn could actually advance equity and contribute to poverty reduction. And at least in my mind and many others over the years, that's kind of been the energy that's motivated many of us to work in the sector field. So you'll learn more about the book in a moment, and hopefully you'll dive into a chapter or two. It's one of those books that I don't think I've ever read it from beginning to end. I start somewhere and have a circuitous voyage of kind of where it takes me. I have to admit, over the last few days, as I've looked back in it, that I found things that I hadn't seen before.
Besides typos?
Besides
Yeah,
typos.
no mistake.
And not as many of those as I would have thought. But, you know, a good example is one of the chapters, I think it was actually the one that Earl Buford and Laura Dresser wrote on Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership, sort of asked the question in the end, well, where are workers in sector strategies? Where are their voices? Where is that knowledge? How is that kind of conveyed? Well, that's a very important idea. I'm not sure we've taken full advantage of in many of our efforts. You know, in the conclusion to the book, Maureen and I talk about some challenges for the field, the sector workforce field. There hasn't been one big dramatic policy win federally related to sectors. There's a real issue about an issue that remains about how you finance this intermediary role I talked about, the organizing work. There's a question about the relevance of sector strategies to the production of so many low-wage jobs. How does a sector strategy work there? And I think number of the chapters really begin to address that and really bring to the surface some of the strategies related to sector work from 20 years ago that haven't, in some ways, got as much attention around job quality and economic development. And then there's some fatigue in the philanthropic field and others about supporting sector work. We've been at it 20 years. It's a great story, but 20 years more than stretches the attention span of most foundations. But we also see some positive trends. There's 15, 20 million middle-skilled jobs that really require skill training over the next 6 to 7, 10 years. There's a lot of renewed interest in cradle-to-career continuums and how we work that, and the top end of that around careers is the place where sector work can really make a contribution. And there's a broader revival in a discussion around skills and the importance of skill development for the economy. So our hope with the book is really to stimulate a set of conversations about how to keep building the sector field. We want to do that with policy folks and program leaders. We think there's more research that needs to be done and communication about that research, about the impacts of sector strategies and how they contribute not only to quality of life and opportunity, but also to economic well-being. And we think we need to redouble our efforts to figure out a way to create a win-win relationship with business more broadly. So in conclusion, let me just throw out one wild observation about sector strategies to mull on as we talk today. And to some degree, and this is my exaggeration, sector strategies are kind of a workaround. If we had a robust apprenticeship system with on-ramps and pre-apprenticeships, and it was something that a lot of folks bought into, would we need sector strategies? Well, we could argue that. Today, though, there's beginning to be a much larger conversation about expanding apprenticeships, and we don't know where that'll go. Will it be more rhetoric than investment? Will it really connect to social equity objectives? These are all things that the sector field could actually contribute to as part of an advocacy agenda. And it might actually provide some of the sustainable financing legs for the sector field going forward, not just next year, but over the next decades. So as Maureen said, connecting people to work has been 2 years in the making, and as these things grow, it's late by about a year, but at the same time, it's right on time. We have a lot to be proud of in the sector field. This hasn't been the creation of a program or a single policy. It's really been about entrepreneurial leaders in a variety of sectors coming together to build a strategy, a practice, a field that I think has made a huge difference in many, many ways. So with that, thank you for coming, and I'll turn it back to my co-editor and chair of the discussion, Maureen Conway. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bob. So great. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to just sort of give a couple of framing remarks for our conversation here, and sort of formally introduce the panelists, and we'll have, I'll probably try to have 40 minutes or so maybe of discussion so that we can leave time, because I see many other knowledgeable people in this audience, and we really want to make sure we have time at the end to bring you into this conversation as well. So just quickly, because you know, I've spent some time trying to define sector strategies, and I'm actually not going to do that right now because usually people disagree with me. Or they come up with the different names. So there's just a couple of things that I wanted to say. So the sector strategy, it's a strategic approach, and it engages a variety of stakeholders, right? So you have workers, you have employers, you have educators, you have nonprofits, you have public agencies, you have labor organizations, you have philanthropy and public investors and others in the context of a regional economy, right? So that's a lot of variables. That's a lot of moving parts. And what that means is that these strategies tend to look different in different places, right? So because of this variation, because of its adapting to the regional economy and the particular industry and the particular set of workers that it's working with, they tend to look different, and so it makes it actually kind of hard to come up with a hard and fast definition. And it's also, but it is a strategic approach that shares principles, but there isn't really a cookbook or a recipe, right? So it's not something that you can easily pick up from one place and put someplace else. But it does share the principles of thinking about the regional economy in a particular segment of that regional economy, thinking about what are the both assets as well as sort of the challenges and barriers of a particular segment of the workforce that they're trying to move forward. Thinking about how can workers and employers both benefit, right? How does this build stronger companies at the same time that it's creating greater opportunity for workers? And how do we sort of think about the way that that's happening in a broader context, so that maybe sometimes some of these things that we just keep running into that are a constant barrier, we can sort of address so that we don't have them, right? So it can be a little thing like, is that credential really required for this job, or can we do some sort of competency assessment? It could be a broader thing like a policy change, but are there things that can be changed so that the system as a whole works better? There's some overlap with other terms, cluster, career pathway. Bob mentioned some of them, but I don't want to have a conversation where we're trying to distinguish what's the difference between them all. I think we're, in this conversation, we're really just trying to talk about what we've learned over the past 10 years and how do we think about that as we're trying to really move this work forward and help this work accomplish kind of its important, critically important goal right now in our economic context of connecting people to work and connecting people to better work. So with that, I'm just going to introduce our panelists very quickly. Next to me is Christopher King. And so these are all old friends, but somehow I have to write down their names so I can read them to you. So Senior Research Scientist and Director of the Ray Marshall Center for Study of Human Resources. And Chris contributed a chapter called Sectoral Workforce and Related Strategies, What We Know and What We Need to Know. Next to Chris is Sheila Mcguire, who is now a workforce development consultant of Sheila Mcguire Consulting, and spent many years at Public-Private Ventures, where many of you may know her from. And her capacity talked about her long work in building capacity, called Building Capacity to Prepare America's Workers for 21st Century Jobs. And next to Sheila is Andy Van Clunen, Executive Director of the National Skills Coalition, and his chapter was Will Workforce Policy Finally Catch Up to Sector Practice? So Chris, I'm going to start with you. And your chapter looked at the evidence about sector strategies. And, you know, it's been 10 years since American Assembly, and we've been talking about them for a while now. So to what degree can we say more about the evidence of effectiveness of sector work?
Well, the good news is we can say, I think, a lot more. But first, I do want to promise to Bob, I'm going to do my part to help make this a bestseller. I've kept Workforce Intermediaries on my reading list in human capital every spring for a decade. So I've been waiting for this book to come out myself. So I'll do what I can. So when we were in upstate New York at the American Assembly a decade ago, if you looked out there to see what do we know with any real confidence, what we find in the literature then was a bunch of process studies, some implementation studies, and there's plenty more of that out there now. What I did in the chapter was to focus in on those things that kind of meet that next level of rigor. So they're not all random controlled trials, but there are a couple of experiments. There's several quasi-experiments. There's some ROI work. So I focused in on those and really looked at not just long-term labor market impacts, but also what statistically significant impacts do we find on program participation and service receipt. And for those of you who've tracked some of this literature over the years, you probably know one of the biggest problems we've had in the workforce training evaluation field is many of the people who get, quote, assigned to a service never get it. And the proliferation of services out there that controls or comparison group members can get has gone up. So we often produce results that say, well, there's not much there. In fact, there's a lot going on there, but it's kind of buried underneath. So I looked at really 5 program evaluations, and it was a little touchy because I had Sheila and Maureen's evaluation of the 3 programs to start with. So Perscolas Jewish Vocational Services in Boston and the Wisconsin program that was mentioned earlier. We did a quasi-experiment looking at Capital Idea, which is in my hometown, and kind of the grandson of Project Quest, which many of you know in San Antonio. And the Ray Marshall Center actually designed that project with the IAF network. We also looked at MDRC's experimental evaluation of the Comprehensive Employment Training replication. We looked at IBEST. We looked at the Year Up evaluation that Economic Mobility did. So what do we find? So if you look at program effects, and this is extremely important, you find very large effects on service receipt for those folks going through the treatment group relative to control. So for example, participation, education, and training in the 3 programs that Maureen and Sheila evaluated, 32 points higher. All right? I mean, if you look at the National Evaluation of Welfare to Work Services, there was only 1 program out of all the sites they had that actually boosted participation in services. So this is a very substantial effect. The CET evaluation, youth got 105 more hours of training to the controls, 21 points higher in terms of credentials. So, and you can see effects like that, I think, throughout these programs. I think that speaks to the important role of the Workforce Intermediary organization, again, in keeping those partners and stakeholders together and making sure it's not just getting referred to something, but making sure someone gets the training. So what about the impacts? If we look to the labor market, we find a similar story in terms of employment outcomes, not universal, but if you look at, so year up in iBest, you don't see a big increase in employment, but for year up, you see a major increase in the share of the targeted kinds of jobs that they were getting people into. So again, a purposeful program effect. But in the other programs, you see employment effects lasting 2 to at least 7.5 years. The Capital Ideas study that we did, we now have about 9 years of follow-up data. And you see a lasting impact and a significant increase in employment. To go along with that, the impact on earnings 2 to 7.5 years later is 12 to 30 points higher for the treatment group. So we're seeing real lasting impacts on employment for the most part and on earnings for the people going through the programs. And just one final thing. So we actually went to the stage of taking those impacts, doing a cost accounting and looking at return on investment. And what we find is for taxpayers, for 10 years, and mind you, this is based on almost 8 years of actual program follow-up data, 9% rate of return for taxpayers, 39% for society over a decade. The results are even higher after if you project them out for 20. So the sum of the story is we know a lot more. It's not a huge amount of evidence, but it is very well done studies. And what we find is significant impacts on program services, employment, earnings. There's some pieces we don't know, but I'll come back to that later in the discussion.
Good, that's great, thank you. So Sheila, so we have some programs that have produced some pretty good results.
Yes.
But you know, as you know, there's sometimes this critique that there's only these few programs or there are these boutique programs and we can't spread this work. And indeed, you know, as we were talking about, the work isn't that simple sometimes. So, but in your chapter, you and Pat Jenny really kind of look at, so what does it take to support organizations and strengthen the field so that more of this work can happen? So maybe you can just tell us a little about what you've been learning about supporting capacity in this field.
Sure, absolutely. It's funny, I think the boutique criticism misses the point. I was thinking about this the other day about would we call the small schools movement boutique? And I think it's that there may be smaller programs, but they're unified in many senses by a common set of approaches. And in fact, you could argue that some programs, as they need to grow in relation to the need of the labor market, not just in relation to the need of the people to be served, that by nature, some sector programs need to be small. And so I think the boutique argument is one that I think we need to sort of push away from in terms of the commonness that unites the programs as opposed to the individuality that each of them has. Both of those are important factors. I think as my co-author Pat Jenny from the New York Community Trust, who's chaired the Workforce Development Funders Group in New York City since its inception over 10 years ago, and I looked at this question of what have we learned in 10 years, and that particular group of funders has funded a lot of, and you'll see them laid out in the book, in the chapter, a lot of different efforts that are focused on trying to build the capacity of the field. I think sometimes when we talk about capacity building, the problem with the phrase is it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it's kind of wishy-washy in what do you really mean by capacity building. So what we really try to do in the book is look at a framework that sort of looks at what are the components of capacity building. And we looked at 5 elements. One is the program strategy, like how do you really design a program, nuance to the local needs as well as to the particular target population that you're trying to serve, and really work what that looks like. There's the organizational level. There is not a program in this field that, without the organizational capacities to manage data and manage multiple contracts. A colleague of mine was saying in New York, 27 contracts to run his workforce development division. And so those organizational capacities that are different from the program capacities but feed very importantly together, those are another set of really important capacities that we need to look at as we break down what capacity building means for the field. The third is sort of the system level. How do all the parts of the system work together, and how can you have them work together more effectively, both on the employer side and on the public funding side. We have this interesting third-party pay system in many cases, right, where you have your employer customer, you have your job seeker customer, and then you have the third party who's paying for the services in many cases. So how do you work that? What's the capacities there that need to be developed? And then two other important levels. One is the field level. And my experience is we talk a lot about this being a competitive field, but in New York and in other cities, I think we're seeing more and more people coming together to create an identity as a workforce development field and a professional identity as a workforce development person within the field. And I think those are really very important capacity elements to think of. And then lastly, although in our lovely little graphic in the book, it's in the middle, which is at the individual level. And this is actually a level I think that we do not pay enough attention to. We've done over the past, with Aspen Institute at PPV and now in my consulting practice, I probably should have counted, but have not counted, the number of cohort learning-based, program-focused organizational development type interventions that we've done. And those are very, very important. And they're often aimed at leadership. And I think those are very, very important and critical. And I think I'm kind of amazed, because we're in those rooms all the time, how empowering it is when leaders and managers of organizations come together to talk about practice only in an environment that is constructed to be non-competitive. I think we've done some of them that are geographically based, where you're bringing together people from the same system to work together in a learning cohort kind of environment. That's more tricky because it's more competitive. It takes more work, and we made some real mistakes on how to really deal with the competitiveness and the politicalness of that. But capacity building that's focused at that level, I believe, can really drive change. But when those program managers and those leaders go home, and I've had many of them say this, their ability to implement the vision of what they want to see happen often rests on the backs of frontline workers who are often have come through many different pipelines to be in the workforce development field. Many different backgrounds, many different formal education. And I've actually got this theory these days that we kind of behave like other industries that we offer our services to, which is in New York City, if you're a good job developer, if you're an employer-facing person, then you're going to hop. And the New York City Workforce Professionals Training Institute that focuses on training of frontline workers did a survey a couple of years ago, and over 50% of the frontline workers were considering changing focus or organization within a year in the next year. And I think what that leads to is a great deal of destabilization, where we need stabilization in terms of relationships with employers and relationships with individual job seekers and workers, and that we really have a need to look at what I love to call the workforce in terms of what it really means to train people, particularly, and we're going to talk about this, where there's potential in the future. I do want to say, I think that yes, we do have these very unique models that need to be locally baked. We do have these ongoing, we do have these common elements that run across them that I think in your chapter, Chris, you pretty clearly lay out, both the mirror in the evidence. So it's about working interventions on each one of these levels to release the capacity that's really out there. And I think one of the issues is somehow when we talk about capacity building, we're thinking about fixing some little organization. And I think what we wanted to do with this is to say, let's look at all the components that contribute to an organization's or a partnership's or an intervention's effectiveness, and look at what it means to build capacity across those elements.
Great, thanks, Sheila. So Andy, so now we come to the policy piece of it, and you sort of posed this question, and maybe you could just say a little bit more for us, like, so will workforce policy ever catch up? But why has it lagged, and what does that mean, and what are the implications of that? And are there some opportunities that policy could go in now that could better support sector practice?
Sure. Well, so first, thanks for inviting me to come, even at the last minute. I don't take any offense by that. I apologize that I'm a poor substitute for Laura Dresser, and I'm also apologize that I know we would have loved to have had a practitioner up here kind of talking about about the work of some of these great partnerships, including some that are represented here in the room. At least I'm fortunate as somebody who's working on these policies that I work with a lot of great sector partnerships from throughout the country. And I will say, if you take a look at the work that they've been doing for the better part of the past 15 years, I mean, we should acknowledge that the field is where it is today because of public policy. It didn't start, I mean, most of the field really started back in the late 90s, early aughts. It was mainly private money, primarily foundation money, that really kind of started to build this field, primarily focused on low-income workers in a certain set of industries. But over time, you know, the fact that people know about sector partnerships or workforce intermediaries or industry partnerships, whatever different folks call them, is largely because public policy did start to pay attention, in large part because a lot of those practitioners were trying to educate policymakers about the work that they were doing, and increasingly their employer partners and other stakeholders were actually talking about them as well. And so in part of the book, you know, part of my chapter tries to kind of look at what's happened over the past 15 years, primarily here in DC, but also in the States in terms of where policy has been trying to catch up to where the sector field has been. And if you look at, you know, there's been a fair amount of resources coming from Washington, particularly through discretionary resources that have been coming from the Clinton administration. There was a sectoral demonstration grant program that you were an evaluator of. There was a range of demand-driven grants under the Bush administration out of the Department of Labor, some of which were supporting things that we would probably recognize as sector partnerships. And most recently, you know, part of the challenge about writing a policy chapter in a very rapidly changing policy environment, there's new stuff to talk about over the past year, but as of when the chapter was being written, at least we had the recovery grants that the Recovery Act grants that had come out from the Obama administration. And so in each of those different circumstances, we had a lot of discretionary money that was going out there that was helping to create some of these industry partnerships or sector intermediaries. And we had the discretionary money that was available to states, the 15% money under WIA, which many states use to start to develop sector partnership strategies, sometimes guided by the best practices of existing practitioners, guided by foundation investments with things like the NGA Sector Academy, which is trying to teach states about how to think about this particular approach to employing people long-term in a particular industry. Now, with that has brought some diversification, and as Bob said, so as you've kind of gotten more people involved in the field and various different ways that we've been investing in it, there are a bunch of different things that we are now calling sector partnerships, which does kind of create some challenges when you're thinking about, okay, if you want to create a set of policies that takes this to scale, which are the models that you're going to adopt and kind of replicate? And I think that continues to be a challenge for the field. But I think the bigger challenge for us here in the US is that while we've had discretionary resources and flexible resources, it's never really been the fundamental way that we think about how we're going to make investments in workers' human capital writ large. So it's not the way that we structure our labor-funded training programs or our Perkins career and technical education programs in our high schools and our colleges, or even parts of our higher education funding that's supposedly preparing people for jobs. That's not really, there are other countries with which we compete where they automatically start with the set of industry stakeholders, employers, and other stakeholders to figure out how do we want to target this range of public resources to preparing people for jobs in our particular industry. And we don't typically do that. So a lot of the folks who have done this work have done this with some flexible foundation resources from discretionary resources, and then kind of figure out how to fit that into what are these otherwise structured WIA, CTE, and HEA programs. Now, I do think that that's changing, but because the question is, why has it been that way? And I offer a couple different explanations in the chapter. One of which I do think, though, which has taken a long time to get folks to recognize, goes to something that Bob had mentioned. We're very good at funding education and training providers. We have created a system, at least under WIA, where we are funding an infrastructure that's trying to get information to a set of workers about job availability and education and training providers that are out there. We have not done a good job of recognizing that there's a different type of capacity and a different type of expertise and standing within an industry to kind of do the things where you're bringing multiple employers together who are competing with each other to figure out how to come up with some common sets of standards that can be developed and articulated back to high schools and colleges and community-based training programs, labor unions, and what have you. And I think that that's where understanding that talking about that additional capacity was not in lieu of the capacity that we needed to develop and maintain for, say, the WIA infrastructure and for education training providers, but it was an additional complement that we needed to think about with a different set of resources and a different set of performance measurements to kind of figure out whether or not we were hitting our mark in that kind of infrastructure. And I think that that is an idea that is slowly starting to catch on that we're now talking about sector partnership strategies as something over here, but there's much more conversation now in Washington about how to embed it and how we think about all of these formula-funded programs. And I think that's really some of the more exciting stuff to talk about moving forward.
Yeah. Great. Great. So I think one of the things that motivates a lot of us about this work, and certainly a lot of the funding, is to think about how it can expand, certainly from our perspective, how it can expand economic opportunity, particularly for low-income and struggling workers, right? And so, I think many of us in our work have had the opportunity to meet some of the participants in these programs and to see how this has happened. Personally, I sometimes think of this woman, Joy, was this woman who was a participant at Project Quest that Chris mentioned earlier. And, I first sort of saw her because we do some evaluation work. She sort of showed up in the survey data. And there's this woman, and she's got 4 kids, and she's been in and out of a shelter, and, her education is a little spotty. She has some work history, not much. And you're thinking, is this really going to work? 4 kids is a lot, and this is tough. She's been on and off welfare a bit, right? So this is statistically not the person that you're thinking is going to be you're thinking this person's going to have a hard time. So then a couple years later, she shows up in the data again, and she's gone through this program. She got trained to be an IT network administrator. She's got a pretty good job. She's stabilized, and it's like, wow, that really worked. Her income was about 2.5 times what it had been before. It's amazing, right? So, and then I got the opportunity to meet her and really through a focus group and hear her story about what it was like sort of going in a shelter and what it was like because she was divorced from her husband and how that sort of personal relationship caused a number of issues in terms of all kinds of things, childcare, transportation, how you manage your daily life and how you manage kids and home and work. And, so she was a tremendous inspiration, and I got to see her 2 years again, and her kids were all in school at that point, and she was really in a great place in her life. And she really did credit this program, right? So you think about this and you think, why are there not more programs like this? Why can they not, serve more? Because there's so much more need than these programs are addressing. So I guess that's really the question that I wanted you all to sort of think about is, what do you see as the opportunity of this work to improve the economic fortunes of low-income children, of low-income individuals and families, and what are the limitations in terms of being able to reach the large number of people that need this kind of help?
That's a big one.
Yeah, go ahead. You just tackle that.
So just to pick up on your comment and one of Andy's parting shots, I think part of what holds us back from moving those things to scale is the fact that the U.S. is a funny country in its own way. We worship markets. We think markets are going to arrange all of this stuff, right? If we just pay the providers in education and training and rely on the employers to come in and tell us what they want, things will magically come together because the market is, the invisible hand will do it. And I think what we've seen over many years is that, in fact, that is definitely not the case. And we're seeing widening inequality. We're seeing reduced economic mobility. So I think it is definitely a struggle to take these programs and strategies, I should say, that don't really have a dedicated funding source and to convince people to support that function that makes it really happen. So your person Joy, somebody lined up those supports. Somebody made sure she got through the program. There's cohort models, there's peer supports, there's all of these things that contribute to somebody actually getting the services, attending the classes, and even stabilizing their family situation. So as some of you know, we've designed a career pathway sectoral strategy in Tulsa, Oklahoma called Career Advance. It's now funded by the Health Professions Opportunities Grant out of the Affordable Care Act. But that's really about serving the moms and some dads of Head Start children and early Head Start children in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A whole new set of struggles, challenges, but we're seeing early results that suggest that if you put those pieces in place, it really does help families progress towards economic self-sufficiency. The trick is to get it supported over time. So one of my takes on that and this is not in the chapter, but I'm sure we'll get there eventually, it's about repurposing and being very explicit and intentional about bringing existing resources to bear and leveraging where you need to. And that may be foundations like Casey. It can also be local funds, as Austin tends to do. We have city and county tax dollars going in. They support capital ideas. Same thing in San Antonio. So there are localities that recognize the value, and in fact, they've seen our ROI numbers, which helps leverage some of those dollars, I think. There are also state funds which are focused on community colleges. There are even some funds that are designed to foster the spread of sectoral and career pathway strategies. So I think, again, there are pockets around the country that have recognized the value of those things, and they are stepping up for those investments. So I think that's at least one modest answer.
Two things come to mind. First is, in terms of thinking about this from a capacity point of view, I've been working over the last year or so with a group of practitioners in New York City who are looking at adapting sectoral strategies, a framework of young adults. And one of the programs there is in a very poor community in East New York, and its major anchor employer is a paratransit provider. And because they're a deeply embedded economic development, housing, workforce development organization, that's been their entree into that world. And they've been working program there for a while. They joined this capacity building initiative, and we had Paraprofessional Healthcare Institute, Steve Dawson, many of you know him very well, come and do the opening and talk about the 20-year history of paraprofessional healthcare. Two very bright, fabulous people in the room, not much background in workforce development, youth development folks. They heard the vision, and somebody said, well, it could take us 20 years. Some other bright person in the room said, oh no, he's done it first, so we know how to do it. I mean that. And then this particular group took a look, dived deep into what the need of this particular employer and their anchor employer in the community was, and it led to an understanding of the needs of the paratransit sector, niche sector, 18 providers in the city system of moving disabled people around. Now, they're at the very beginning, but because of the vision, and these are union jobs, but they're low-wage jobs, so they're high-turnover jobs. The employer has like a 28% retention rate from day 1 to day 90, can't keep its employers. They're actually going to be going on site to work with the employer to understand what that's about. But why do I tell the story? I tell the story because I think there are some models that right now we need to be getting out in a very concrete way to people, particularly around low-wage occupations, that allow them to see a vision of how they can move that and engage. You know, sometimes, I've been in workforce development for 30 years, so I feel I can say this. Sometimes I think we get in our own way. These two individuals, you know, like weren't in this field at all, but they came up with a strategy. And so I think that it's very, very important that we begin to seed ideas. For some people, work first, rapid attachment. If you've been in the field for 15 years, that's what you think the field is. Mm-hmm. But in fact, there are all these other strategies out there that we need to, in a practical, hands-on way, deliver to people. The other thing is, I think we tend to underestimate, at least in New York City, the role of welfare reform, and in New York City, its continuing emphasis on rapid attachment. I think we have to be honest, and we cannot continue to ask job developers and the organizations and the strategic employment people, how many jobs did you get me this week? And pay for how many jobs you get. And you all know the bizarre paperwork that comes with documenting. If I had $1 for every job developer who's looking for a pay stub right now, I'd be a wealthy woman. You know, so how we, and I'm very hopeful that some of the data quality campaign stuff, where we get to not have to be putting in the 30-day, the 90-day, where we can take a longer look at what's successful to release some of this pressure. But I think we talk out of both sides of our mouths when we ask for the strategic, but we reward for the particular. And we have, in the case of several programs that are working on the innovative side, some funder resistance too about why are we paying for an employer service? Like, why isn't the employer paying for the service? So I think we really have to acknowledge the role that money plays in the system and really think about how to maneuver that to release capacity that is there. There is no one more conscious of the pain of frontline workers than the individual who's held accountable for keeping them in that low-wage job.
So thank you for the advertisement for the Workforce Data Quality Campaign, which I won't talk about this afternoon. But let me build on a couple things that Sheila did say. So I do think, and this has been a long-standing tension within the field, is when you're looking at low-income folks, how you can best serve them. There are strategies that are trying to figure out how to take people who are in low-income jobs and low-wage industries and making those jobs better through a sector strategy. And there were efforts to try to figure out how to take people, low-income people who typically have not been employed in higher-wage industries, manufacturing, some of the construction trades or whatever, and how can you change how they think about doing business in a way that they're diversifying the workforce and bringing those folks in. And I do think there's certainly recognition within the field that those are different ways to approach this problem. But again, from the perspective of somebody who's trying to help people write policy, that's a subtlety. That's about an industry-specific strategy that sometimes gets missed when they're just trying to come up with kind of like, what's the cookie-cutter thing that I can put into a funding SGA to get folks to do. So I think that's one of the challenges for low-income folks, is that there's different pathways that work, but they require different strategies. I think also the point that Sheila makes, which is, we just still don't want to spend a lot of money on the education and training of low-income people. Or if we do, we expect to get immediate results within 6 months or so. And the reality is that all of these successful partnerships have demonstrated that the returns are real, but they're typically over the long term, and it typically requires a variety of investments both on the job and off the job to help people succeed. So that is also a challenge. And I think in addition, because, and this goes to some of the things that Chris was talking about, because we do have when we have these partnerships that are trying to bring together different kinds of funding and resources under different areas of public policy, we still kind of have this challenge of making it easier to bring training resources together with social support and family support resources and other things that people will need in order to succeed. It's just because of how we write the laws, it's how we implement the laws. It's that the Department of Labor and the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services don't typically talk to each other when we're trying to figure out how to get to this common goal of getting more low-income people gainfully employed. Again, I think there's some changes in that recently, but that we still have a long way to go. And those are part of the things that are holding back from more low-income folks benefiting from what we think is a pretty robust set of strategies that we kind of let them do what they do.
Great. So I'm going to ask a quick round around a couple things around business engagement that I would like you to talk to, and then I want to sort of open it up for the rest of you all to kind of get your questions in. So be thinking about that, and I think we'll have a couple of mics that will also come around as well. But you know, I think there's a couple of things that you brought out in this business engagement question. I mean, there's this question of you know, I remember 10 years ago, we were really thinking that businesses might pay more, and then Sheila, you brought up this issue that businesses aren't always paying for some services that maybe we would think they were, and so what does that mean for us in terms of how we think about business engagement and what the strategy is, and are we making the right asks? I think there's this question around, you know, are we asking for the right things in terms of should we be trying to sell training, or should we be trying to work with businesses, particularly in low-wage sectors, on opportunities for job redesign and different kinds of things that could make the jobs better, could benefit the business and benefit the workers in those sectors? Or, you know, so are there some different sort of strategies that we need in terms of business engagement? Are we just struggling to bridge the cultural gaps between public, nonprofit, and private? You know, is it just different timelines? Sort of where are misses? What have we learned? And, you know, how do we kind of move forward in the business engagement space? So it's another big question. Mm-hmm. And who wants to start? Doesn't have to be Chris this time.
Okay,
Andy, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll make mine quick. So to pick up on something that Chris says, I'm not an economist, but I pretty much know that markets don't clear, that there's a lot of external costs that go to what it takes to prepare somebody from entry level, or for many people that we're talking about who are reading and computing below the high school level, to get them into a skilled job that maybe 10 years ago they might have been able to qualify for with some support, for which now just the skill requirements are very different, the flexibility requirements are very different. And it's not a matter that the wages aren't high enough to get people to prepare for those jobs. It literally is that we don't have a way to deal with some of those disconnects. And so I do think that the role that these partnerships are playing in terms of trying to absorb what are some of the disconnects between labor supply and labor demand, in particular industries where it's still not functioning very well, I think is incredibly important. I think we work with a lot of employers. We're part of an effort called Business Leaders United for Workforce Partnerships. Primarily small and medium-sized employers have been participating in these sector partnerships, many of them for many years. who are willing to talk about the value that it's bringing to their businesses and to their industries. These are highly committed. Many of them are owners of their companies. And yet the reality is it's hard to ask an employer to figure out how to take somebody from an 8th grade reading level to a 12th grade reading level before they can hire them. That's a difficult thing for an employer to do. We can work with that employer to figure out how to get those folks on the job, how to learn the skills, and how to coordinate that with what they're learning back in a community organization or a community college or a labor union, what have you. But the employer is not going to do that. We're trying to get employers to at least be convinced of the value of participating in a partnership effort like that, but it's hard to get them to pay for it in a way because it's a bigger step than I think many of them have been hiring for a decade or so.
And I would say, I mean, it's great that there are some employer initiatives going on, but we're seeing some headwinds out there. A lot of the employer community is simply backing away from their HR functions and not necessarily training employees at the same level they used to. In addition, we all know the dynamics in the market. They're shedding some of those initial rungs on what would have been a career ladder, and that's provided by temporary help firms, which some of them do a wonderful job of training, but not all of them. So I think it's become a much more complex environment to do those things. The other thing we've observed in years of working this field is that basically employers would be more than happy to have you come and have the conversation about healthcare, for example, really good one, in nursing. Bring me more trained nurses. Help me get the community and technical college, the university, to train more nurses, create more practicum slots. But when you talk to them about the working conditions, the wages, the shift problems, well, you know, we really don't want to get into that. So I think the very key functions of a workforce intermediary, when it gets into that workplace discussion, can be very difficult, and maybe it's not a surprise they don't want to pay us, the workforce intermediaries, to come in and have that difficult conversation, but it's a critical one.
For me, I mean, I think businesses look very different dependent on sector size, etc. And so I happen to feel that at this moment particularly, that one, I think we have made some progress. I definitely think that there's been a shift in the way of thinking. It hasn't permeated all the way down within the field itself, but we have made some progress. But I think there's this really important niche around small and mid-sized companies. And it does not, and that we need to really focus on getting trained up, you'll hear a theme, industry experts. And in some way, it does not take as much as we think it does. Because if you're talking about, I'll go back to my friends, the paratransit providers, 18 of them, and you're talking about an industry where these are all small 200 people shops, their HR people are not in tune with what's going on necessarily nationally and locally. You can actually very quickly get and bring value to that conversation if you have invested in your own knowledge about the system, about that, in order to bring value into that business. And I think that calls for new service delivery mechanisms to employers, and that calls for more focus on who are the industry experts. And there's the strategic, there's kind of the level that you're talking about, Andy, too, at the systems level, right, where you need to bring people together. And then there's the hand-to-hand combat in local communities, where employers are trying to survive in this competitive workforce, and people in the community are trying to improve their lives. And I really do think there's an interesting space for that. It won't happen unless we focus to make it happen, but I think it could if we did.
Great, thank you. Questions? If you don't have questions, I'll keep Colin. So please introduce yourself when you ask a question.
I'm Colin Austin. I'm with MDC. And first, I just wanted to thank Maureen and Sheila and others. One thing you mentioned a little bit was the Sector Skills Academy. I was part of the first class, maybe that was 10 years ago. But,
It was.
It was.
but it was the best professional development experience I ever had. And I know I keep in touch with many of those colleagues, so that was, I think, a really important piece of building this field. So my question is, you know, we're still facing policy issues, workforce development. It's hard to understand, hard to quantify. There's philanthropic fatigue. one area that there does seem to be, building energy is around community colleges. There is more federal attention. You can't, turn around without bumping into a completion initiative or investment. People really get the idea that now community colleges play a central role, and they've always been workforce intermediaries and such. But my question is, what do you see happening with that? Chris, you mentioned colleges a couple of times, and state work that's starting to shift how colleges are paid to perhaps include completion and maybe employment, and those performance measures are changing. But what is the role of the community college, going forward, given where they're at?
So I would say the part of the issue we deal with is that community and technical colleges are not the same throughout the country. So some of them perform intermediary functions, some of them are simply education and training providers, but where those local colleges perceive their role as being paramount in workforce development, they're often quite strong, and they're in collaborations, and they work closely with their employer advisory committees. That's fine, you can work with that. Other communities, the community college really is still a junior college. They're a feeder to the four-year institutions, and they don't necessarily see the value in engaging with employers. Now, I think the push from Washington for years now has been to kind of move that along, but it's not uniform. So I think we still need to keep pushing and incentivizing them. And there are moves, many of you probably know, to shift funding for community colleges and even four-year institutions, certainly in Texas, to put at least a chunk of that money based on labor market outcomes. Now, there's a quantum shift. It also means the data quality campaign has its work cut out for it. One of the things we struggle with is you can only get employment and earnings data really well within your state. And if you have a program that serves folks that are in a national market, if it's wind farms, solar energy, or an MBA program, those things, those people are going to go wherever they're going to go. And if you can't document it well, you're not in a good place if you're going to tie money to it. So we have issues that we still need to deal with, and what are the right metrics. And I do think the new ones, if we get the bill passed and signed after 11 years, those metrics look much better than the ones we had, and that might be a help. But again, we still need a good data source to document labor market effects.
And I just want to comment too on the community college piece. I think that they have an important role to play, but they don't play the entire role.
Yes.
So I think that, I sort of was talking about the woman Joy, right? So she got an education, but that wasn't the only thing that helped her, right? There was a whole set of services and connecting to social services that helped her have the time and space in her life to learn. There was a whole set of activities around cohort and coaching and helping her sort of conceptualize herself as a professional in this industry that she was trying to break into. There was a whole set of industry navigation services and creating new relationships and new industry networks. And those are all things that are not, that were in this case not done by the community college and are often not done by community colleges. So I think if we just think narrowly that the only problem is people don't have a certain skill, I think we're kind of missing the bigger picture of the work. And I don't think community colleges, to those difficult conversations about what's actually happening within the workplace and are there other issues to it, I don't think community colleges are going to move into those conversations that I think are going to be really important as we think about where do we go in terms of employer engagement. So,
can I just make, and I do think that at least federal support for the important work the community colleges is doing. I think there has been some recognition of this, is that, and this is not just with community colleges, but in a lot of different discretionary funding now, highlighting partnership not just as kind of an add-on, but that the recognition that there's going to be a greater diversity of people who are going to be served if colleges are working in partnerships, not just with employers, but with community-based organizations and the workforce boards and others. And I think that, again, policy doesn't do a very good job of that, but I think the institutions who are the high performers figured that out a long time ago and figured out how to work in partnership with other organizations, even when their funding or their performance measures didn't reward it.
Right. In the TACT grants that the Labor Department's putting out actually do increasingly. Each round, they're pushing more towards industry partnerships and using things like prior learning assessments to speed up the process to degrees. So there's movement, but that's, those probably aren't permanent funding streams either.
Are there other- Phyllis?
I'm Phyllis Eisen, thank you. I'm a board member of the National Skills Coalition. I've been wondering, having been at that very famous, what was it called, Bob? The American Assembly, and over the years watching organizations develop very strategic approaches to this. I have actually a difficult but simple question. What does success look like? What does when can we declare, mission accomplished? When can we say this is now a path that the United States is on? Yeah, it could take another 50 years because we're slow in this country. But what are the criteria? And Maureen, you've done so much evaluation. All of you have been evaluators. Is there a place where we can say this is an American strategy? And all we have to do is get the models out and the strategies to the local level, and they'll move forward with it when they can.
Did I say I was going to take a few questions at this point? I think I did.
Yeah. I don't think we can take that one.
Actually, I'll bite on that one.
Go ahead. You can,
So-
and you can.
And we've thought about this in not just in the sectoral career pathway arena, but in the two-generation work that Aspen's doing through Ascend and other projects. So I think, and we don't have good evaluations looking at these issues, really. That was part of my list of things yet to be done. We don't know much about how the career advancement process really is happening with these. We don't know what the systems changes are looking like yet. I mean, it's a messy area out there. But if we looked out at the workforce community, at all these workforce boards, their relationships with community and technical colleges, the other support, if we saw that the preferred way of doing business out there was essentially to organize around growth sectors and to structure career pathways and think about the supports that students, participants, and many of these, by the way, are parents. So we're pushing a two-gen frame as they look at that, because you have a unique opportunity when somebody wants to get a credential or a skill in a growth field. If they've got young children, why are the kids looked at as a barrier, right? Oh, that's a child care problem. No, it could be an early childhood development opportunity. So we're trying to kind of push that notion and deal with these things more holistically. So if we began to see that as the main way of doing business, I would think we could kind of begin to rest a little bit.
So, and I guess I would just say, to build on that a little, I mean, I think success is when we don't accept the notion of working poor, right? I think success is when we have people who are able to get the skills that they need to succeed and able to go find places where they can use those skills and have those skills be rewarded. And, you know, that we're moving forward in a way where work really works. And work, you know, my personal reason for coming to this work is to address the issues of poverty and economic opportunity, right? And I think to the degree that we start becoming less comfortable with this idea that working poor is okay and more building systems where that doesn't happen, then that's when I think we have success.
I would say success, we all know that social capital is what is the highest way in which people get jobs. People get jobs because they know people who know people who know people. That is the way it works. And if sector strategies offer anything to disadvantaged communities, it's proxy, I believe, for social capital. That's why the employer connections matter, is because if you can't bring something to that person's life that expands their social networks, then, so I would say success is when we have enough going on that people who otherwise would not have access can go places and access connections, skills, and social services that allow them to really get a fair shot at getting into the labor market.
So we should be measuring changes in the degree and the depth of their bridging social capital.
Yes.
I mean, bonding, many poor communities have tight bonds, which is bonded social capital, but they don't have the capital that bridges
Absolutely.
outside to greater
Absolutely.
opportunities for economic success.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Martin?
Thank you.
Martin Simon, National Government Association. I want to pick up on Phyllis's question, and should this be an American strategy? And if we
do agree to take it to scale, what's the federal, state, and local role in doing that?
That's to
Well,
you, Andy.
Sure. Yes, Maureen, I think it should be. I mean, to me, so we spend too little on training and retraining people in our labor market so that we are continually maintaining competitiveness at all levels of the labor market. I think we just do that, right? So we know we have limited resources to do that. The only way I think that we get to scale is that we're making sure that we're doing a better job with every dollar that we're investing. And it seems to me that you can't guarantee that, or at least have a decent sense that you're making a good investment, if you don't have a set of stakeholders around the table that are going to ensure the success of that investment. Clearly employers are part of that, but it's these other stakeholders, particularly for lower income folks where we know they're going to need a variety of interventions. We just have to have them at the table. And again, this is the way of doing business with many other countries with which we compete, who are not only looking at how they're spending money, but they are measuring things like not just how many people are getting college degrees, but how many people are getting middle skill credentials, how many people are finding employment, and how are they progressing over time. How is it that we can actually figure out where our investments are not aligning with the labor market? If you're running a business, that would just be common sense. That is not how we've operated here. As Chris said, we've just kind of figured that we put the stuff out there, it's going to work. We need to have some kind of a concerted set of policies that's going to make that happen in a way that a variety of people are going to have access to the opportunity to get those skills and to get into those jobs. And I don't think we can't do it without organizing the labor market in a different way than we currently do.
Okay, yes.
Yes.
Hi, is this on?
Yeah.
Sorry. My name is Kelly Ellsworth. I'm a local job training provider here in DC. I run an organization called Bite Back, and we do computer training. And my comment was that when we're talking about what is success, I think on a national level, what success is teaching the members of our community to love learning, and that learning is a lifelong thing. And one thing that we find at Bite Back is so many of our students are the product of the DC public school system, where the main thing that they came out of with that is a fear of learning, a feeling that they can't learn. And once they got out of school, they decided, I will never learn again. I'm not good at it. And a large part of our job is teaching them, yes, you can learn. No, you're not stupid. And you can keep learning, and learning is fun. And so our greatest triumph is when somebody leaves us to go learn some more, to go to community college or get their GED or go to a certification program. My question for you all is there are a number of people in here that are providers, and thank you, Allison, for letting us know about this. How can the providers work more closely with the researchers and the theorists? How can we help you, and how can you help us? And I was really excited about what you were saying about the learning cohorts. And can we have a learning cohort here in Washington? Can someone organize that?
Okay, Sheila, that's you.
That's me. I think it's a very important question. And I go back to this issue of when the pressure that is on these organizations in this performance world and the need to create space. And I think at the policy level and at the research and academic level, to some degree, foundation level, we have a lot of capacity to think, and that we have capacity to think at the practitioner level, but it's not sourced enough into the dialogue. And I think it's a very important issue. I think certainly we are actually working with Aspen. We're developing some tools out of the Sector Skills Academy that we hope will get up there on Aspen's website, and that other people can download and begin to use to run their own learning communities, somewhat like using using the products from the Sector Skills Academy that Colin spoke to. So I think there is a desire to support this kind of work at the practice level.
It is interesting, though. There used to be a network that was funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. It dates back to the 70s. We had regional institutes. We had other organizations. We were part of. I was part of one at Utah. I was part of one at the University of Texas. They were whacked out of the federal budget in 1981 when Reagan came to town. We've never gotten it back. It's funny because if you look, the National Parks has a network of these. Education has a network of these. Almost every other program area I can think of, but we don't have one in the workforce arena. I think it's I think the National Network and the Sector Academy has done a wonderful job of addressing that in part, but it's simply a missing piece of
Yes.
capacity building in our arena. Now, we work with practitioners and policymakers every day. And there's another avenue to think about, which it doesn't work universally, but I'm actually up here on a trip that was financed in part by our Austin Chamber of Commerce. Well, that's the employer partners. They raise money over and above dues, and they plug that money back into education and workforce development. They pay us to do some data collection and metrics. We work with school districts, community colleges, and it's a natural place they convene, right? We convene once a month with school districts. I mean, so there are other ways to think about creating those learning opportunities and networks.
Great. Last question.
Hello, Ron Hopkins, DC Trust. What type of incentives need to be put in place to enhance employer engagement, especially with regards to training?
Incentives to employers or incentives to Well, so I mean, there are various strategies. Again, it does depend on the type of employer that you're talking about. So the most typical way that we've done it, at least at the federal level, has been through tax credits, which work for some employers, larger employers that are hiring a lot of people. For smaller employers, including many of the types of employers that are part of these partnerships, the number of people that they're hiring and the infrastructure that's required and the lag between when you're paying the wages and when you get it back on your tax filing just doesn't make it much of an incentive. So I think that we have been working a lot on trying to get more kind of on-the-job training funded as a way to get people on the job and help them learn and earn a wage while they're doing that. So I think that Bob's talking about the increased interest in apprenticeship. I think this is another area where I think we've got some new opportunities. But I do think in order to take that to scale, it's hard to do it one employer at a time, particularly one small employer at a time. So I do think that these sector partnership strategies provide a platform to take some of those strategies to scale much more quickly than if we're trying to find every employer is hiring 2 people over the next year and seeing whether or not we can set up an on-the-job training program for them. So.
Right. But I do think that there's, and maybe Sheila, you can speak to this a little bit too, because I do think there's something important about the relationship building aspect that's often not it's hard to resource because it takes time, but this whole, there's sort of setting some incentives with funding streams, but then there's also building the capacity of organizations to go out and build these relationships that I think are key to engaging employers about why they want to make these investments and how these investments can work for them and how this can be part of their overall business model. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I was going, one of the things I think to this question of how to get things, how the voice of the practitioners in one of the projects that I'm currently working on is how you might use real-time data, and it's sort of the workforce development's big data system, right, where you scrape all the sites and you aggregate the data and you can go in with a product and you can look, and there's lots of problems with it, and there's papers out about how it can be used at different levels, right? How can it be used at state level, WIB level, all of that. I really want to understand how it can be used at the local practitioner level, to use it to be able to do strategic targeting, to build the kind of relationships where the value of what you have to, you are able to target in, and we were able to do some interesting work with this in the project where you're able to target in on where employers are hurting. Because when the real incentive for employers is when the pain might go away. And so trying to figure out that and use something like this data system in the hands not only of people sort of at the policy level, but at the practice level to use on the ground, it would also be a really good way to, I know one of your anxieties, I'm sure, Chris, about it is how reliable it is.
Okay.
And there's nothing quite like putting into the hands of practitioners who are going to go and figure out just how reliable it is.
So I would emphasize that. I completely agree. So it's relationships. Is the organization helping me as an employer solve a real problem that I have, right? That's the pain part. And I think in the workforce system, we have a long history of this. It goes back to the private industry councils that were the precursors of the WIBs, and we thought if we just put employers on these governing boards, they would be involved. Well, involvement isn't what you want. You want engagement. And I think in those communities which have had really active workforce boards, and where they've got these industry sector partnerships, employers come to those meetings and they roll up their sleeves. That's a relationship because there's help. and there's understanding of their marketplace in a way that they're not going to get otherwise. So I think it's upping the substance and the content in those conversations and them understanding that they're getting a benefit. We also need to measure those benefits, and we don't do that very well.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I do hope you got a copy of the book. If you didn't, there's copies out in the lobby. I encourage you to take a look. You got to hear from 3 authors today. As I mentioned, there are many more, so please take a look, and please join me in thanking our panelists today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.